Left to die alone, the little girl cried. Then a police officer found her. On a desolate road leading into a quiet little town, a man walked slowly, his gaze heavy with the weight of a stormy sky above. He was an undercover officer, having just completed his final mission after years of living in the criminal underworld. Yet within him there was no sense of victory, only a void that no success could ever fill. Not far from that road, in a run-down house, a little girl of about 10 sat silently by the window, her eyes swollen from crying. She was the daughter of a recently deceased inmate who had died in prison, and with no family left to care for her, she had been abandoned, utterly alone with nowhere to go. As the man passed by, their eyes met. In that fleeting moment, he saw himself in her, an orphaned child once left behind, yearning for affection and belonging. He stopped, walked over gently, and asked in a soft voice, "Would you like to come with me?" The girl looked at him, her eyes glimmering with fragile hope. She nodded. That moment marked the beginning of a journey of healing, not just for her, but for him as well. Together they would confront the wounds of the past, learn how to forgive and rediscover what love truly meant. They say time heals all wounds, but for those who lost loved ones to a buried verdict, time does not heal it, only buries the pain deeper, letting it take root. 19 years ago, a boy stood in a military cemetery. He did not cry, did not speak, and did not glance at the faded photo of his father hastily buried without honors or a flag. His father had been an undercover officer killed in the line of duty. There was no state funeral, no apology, only a letter unsigned delivered to their door. He died trying to save someone unworthy. And the cost was his life. That very night, his mother took his younger sister and fled the city. But he stayed behind, in silence, in rage, in long nights at the firing range and survival lessons no textbook ever taught. Now at 35, that boy returns, not for vengeance, not to seek justice, but to step into the place where his father had fallen, and to finally ask, who was it he tried to save? In a faded old photograph, he had seen the face of a female inmate, her eyes dulled from indoctrination, in a psychiatric correctional facility. She may have been the reason his father died, or perhaps she was the only one left who knew the truth. He drove through the town, the old Dodge groaning with each gear shift. There was no one waiting at the end of the road, no welcome sign. Just a car returning after 7 years, its license plate long forgotten by anyone who might have once cared. His name was Damian Cross. 7 years ago, he vanished from the system, his file marked internal transfer, though in reality, he had gone deep undercover. Embedded within a drug trafficking syndicate, he lived under an alias, slept in cheap motels, and learned how to stay silent when someone was tied to a chair and never seen again. In those 7 years, he witnessed enough to know death wasn't the worst thing. The worst was surviving and no longer knowing where you belong. His father had also been an undercover cop, but he never made it back. A bullet to the head while still living under a false name. His body was found 11 days later, rotting in an abandoned warehouse, barely recognizable. His mother never set foot in a police station again. She took his younger sister and moved far away, no address, no phone number. Every letter she sent contained just one sentence. If you're still alive, don't go back to being a cop. Damian once believed he could be different from his father, that he could serve and survive without vanishing into silence like the man who raised him. But now, 7 years later, he found himself driving the same kind of empty road back, no friends, no family. Just a cold glint in his eyes, the kind only worn by those who've spent too long among nameless faces. The apartment he rented sat on the edge of town near the road that disappeared into the forest. Inside it was hollow, just a thin mattress and a cold coffee pot. Damien set his handgun on the table, unclipped his badge from the lanyard, and stared at the bare wall ahead of him as if searching for a shadow from an old memory. His phone buzzed. A message from the department: unusual incident at cell number 9. A girl found on site. No relatives. No records. Can you verify? Damien stared at the text, his thumb gliding over the screen, as if still unsure how to rejoin the real world. Then slowly he stood, picked up his car keys, and stepped out into the cold silence of the hallway. His return, it turned out, was only the first step into another kind of darkness. And this time it wasn't about solving a case. It was about answering a question he had buried deep for far too long. If a child no one wanted lost in the middle of that darkness were to appear, could he save her? Could he become the person his father had once hoped someone would be for him? And in that moment, for the first time in years, Damien didn't just remember who he used to be. He felt it. Damien's apartment sat on the 4th floor of an aging building near the city's edge. Nothing fancy. Just a worn brown leather sofa, a scratched oak dining table, and a large window facing the railway tracks, where passing trains screamed with the shrill scrape of metal, like memories that never learned how to sleep. The girl sat curled in the corner of the sofa, hugging a pillow, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. On the wall hung a few plain picture frames. No family portraits, only faded snapshots of a tactical team. A tarnished ID badge and a handwritten note pinned inside a wooden frame. Don't let anyone know who you are until you truly understand what you are. Damien, still in his rolled-up black shirt, the old scars on his forearms faintly visible, stepped out from the kitchen and placed a mug of hot cocoa in front of her. No sugar. No questions about preference. Just instinct, the instinct of someone who had once been a child in need of the same quiet gesture. This is temporary, he said calmly. If you don't like it here, we'll find the nearest care center tomorrow. His tone was even, but his eyes maintained a precise distance, far enough not to imprison her, close enough not to let her fall. She didn't respond. Instead, she lifted the cup with both hands. The steam fogged her glasses, but her gaze no longer seemed hollow like it had in the morgue. It was beginning to assess, to calculate, like a young warrior learning how to read the boundaries of safety. On the table nearby lay a folding knife. The blade, though closed, still glinted beside a pair of handcuffs. Without a word, Damien slid them farther out of her reach. She noticed, didn't flinch, just asked softly, "Are you a real cop?" Damien nodded, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a low-profile identification card. No logo, no title, only the words, "Special Liaison Unit," and a string of encrypted numbers no system could trace. "I don't wear a uniform," he said. "No one knows my real name. No one addresses me by rank. And my work isn't allowed to be recorded audio or video." He let out a faint, dry chuckle. "What do you think about that?" She looked down and whispered, "I don't remember my mother's name. I don't remember our address, and there's no one left who calls me by mine." Silence followed, deep and sharp. Her words sliced into Damien's memory like a blade, stirring images of the night his father lay lifeless during a black ops mission, and the quiet, unwitnessed move that followed: no funeral, no closure. He sat down across from her, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, placed it on the table, and slid a pen toward her. "If you'd like," he said gently, "you can choose a new name for yourself." She bit her lip, studying him with long, searching eyes. Then, in shaky, uneven letters, she wrote 3 Mira. Damien didn't ask why. He didn't need to know where it came from. He simply nodded quietly, as if affirming a truth already understood. "Welcome home, Mira." She looked up, and for the first time a faint smile appeared, like a dream flickering across the heart, before it had the chance to disappear. 3 days after Mira moved in with Damien, everything remained wrapped in silence. No crying, no laughter, no games. She stayed in the same corner of the sofa, her eyes following every subtle motion in the apartment. From the way Damien cleaned his gun, checked the hallway cameras, to the moment he drank black coffee at 2 a.m. like a ritual engraved into his bloodstream. Damien never asked Mira about her past. He believed some children shouldn't have to recount their pain just to be accepted. But the past has a way of slipping out quietly without warning. That day the rain came hard. Mira returned soaked after a rushed trip to the old bookstall downtown. Her thin dress clung to her skin, and when Damien reached to hand her a towel, his eyes froze. On Mira's left arm, faint bruises overlapped, forming irregular patterns, as if someone had tried to silence her, not with words, but with persistent, deliberate pain. "Mira, who did this to you?" His voice was low, but each word landed with sharp clarity. She backed away slightly, said nothing, her arms instinctively folding to shield the injury. Damien didn't press her, but a few seconds later she whispered almost involuntarily, "I'm fine. He's dead now." The day the gun went off, his blood got all over his shirt. Silence. Damien felt something shift deep inside him. It wasn't shock, it was empathy so overwhelming it nearly suffocated him. He knew that feeling too well, surviving because someone else had died, and no one dared to mourn them. He stepped forward and sat down in front of Mira, meeting her eyes for the first time since bringing her home. "Mira, in this place you don't have to hide your pain. You don't have to bow your head to the past. But there's one thing I need you to understand: if anyone still breathing ever dares to hurt you again." The sentence stopped. Not because Mira interrupted, but because Damien's grip clenched so tightly that the glass on the table cracked beneath his hand. For the first time, Mira witnessed anger that wasn't meant to control her, but to protect her. Anger that didn't belong to a monster from her past, but to someone finally standing in the space those monsters used to haunt. Damien exhaled slowly, grounding himself. Then he reached into the drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was an old folding knife, its handle made of dark oak, the blade engraved with the symbol of a mission from his days in special operations. He handed it to her, not to attack, just to remember you have the right to live without lowering your head. And if anyone dares hurt you again, even once, they'll have to face you first. Mira took the knife without a word. She didn't ask questions. But from that day forward, she never returned to the same silent corner of the sofa. She began cleaning the kitchen, folding the blankets more precisely. And that night, for the first time, she stopped by Damien's door before going to sleep, leaving behind a whisper as soft as breath: "Thank you for being angry. Not everyone gets angry for me." Damien's third-floor apartment had never been a place one could call warm. But that afternoon, the golden light of dusk streamed through the window, casting a gentler hue over the bare space, softening the edges of its usual austerity. Mira had fallen asleep at the study desk, her head resting on one arm, the other still clutching a thick book about migratory birds. Damien emerged from his office, a worn leather file in his hand. So aged, the cover had taken on the tint of dried rust. He hadn't touched it in 17 years. The file's title read, "Case File 03111A, Operation Silence Officer Declan Cole, Status Deceased. His father's name, height, unit number, time of disappearance, location of the recovered body." Dry lines of text that pierced like blades into memories he had long pretended to forget. Damien turned the pages. Each red mark felt like a heartbeat pounding against his ribs. The field report stated that Declan, undercover at the time within a human trafficking network, tied to high-level political interests, had his cover blown. Backup was never received. His body was recovered after 3 days. No one knew for certain who had pulled the trigger. The appendix read, "Case closed under exceptional circumstances. No further investigation." Damien let out a dry laugh. No further investigation. 3 words that had nearly broken his mother. 3 words that drove his family into exile, living like ghosts. And for years, Damien chose to climb deep into that very system, not to destroy it, but to survive within it. Because he understood something few did, digging too deep too soon could cost his loved ones another irreversible price. But today, Mira was a reminder. She too had been left behind. She too had seen blood spilled. She too had been told to forget. Damien moved to the locked cabinet and pulled out another file, smaller, thinner, but classified under high security clearance. Its title bore a single word: Aurelia. An old network once thought dismantled, tied to the same criminal syndicate his father had infiltrated. For years, it had faded into the shadows. But recent reports showed familiar names resurfacing, wearing new faces, hiding behind new fronts. For the first time in years, Damien unfolded a map and began marking the old locations where the organization had operated. For the first time, he pulled the coroner's report, scrutinized the examiner who filed his father's death certificate, and for the first time, his hand didn't tremble as he picked up the red pen. On the wall of his study, he pinned an old photo of Declan, eyes, bright hair, salt and pepper, a smile that mirrored Damien's own the day he earned his first badge. Beneath it, Damien taped a handwritten note. "They didn't end this, and I no longer have a reason to stay silent." Mira remained fast asleep in the living room. Damien stepped out and gently draped a blanket over her small frame. She smiled faintly in her sleep, as if dreaming of a life just beginning to take root. And Damien had begun his own journey into the same darkness his father once entered. But this time he would not vanish. That night, there was no rain, not even wind. But the silence blanketing the city carried a different weight, one that felt like it was bracing for something unnamed. Damien remained at his desk, the flickering blue light of the monitor casting a pale glow across his hardened features. On the table, his father's old case file lay open, wedged beneath a folder marked in bold red, "Not to be distributed outside surveillance clearance." He was no stranger to late nights, but ever since Mira had come to live with him, he'd made a habit of shutting everything down before midnight, so as not to disturb her sleep. Tonight, he'd forgotten. A strangled scream shattered the stillness from Mira's room. Damien jolted upright. He rushed in to find her sitting bolt straight in bed, drenched in sweat, clutching the blanket with trembling fists, her eyes wide and fixed on something still lurking in the shadows of her nightmare. Damien said nothing. He simply moved closer and knelt by her bed. Mira's voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper, but sharp as shattered glass. "They came back." Damien drew a deep, silent breath. He knew this wasn't just a dream. Mira had survived a manhunt, something darker than most files dared to document. And the worst fears he understood had a way of returning at night, no matter how tightly you locked the doors. He gently brushed her damp hair back, his voice low and steady. "No one touches you here. Not ever again." Mira gave a slight nod, then curled back into the corner of the bed, as if it were the last safe place her soul could rest. Damien closed the door softly behind him and returned to his desk. But as he sat down, his eyes froze on the surveillance feed of a nearby street corner. A traffic cam had picked something up. A dusty black SUV had stopped at the junction of 9th Street. No engine running, no headlights. No one stepped out. For 2 seconds, Damien didn't move. A strange silence took hold inside him, the kind of stillness only undercover cops learned to trust after too many years straddling the line between belief and suspicion. That vehicle, it had appeared once before, in a crime scene photo from the night his father died. He couldn't recall the license plate, but the curved scratch on the left bumper he remembered asking his mother about it as a boy. Could have been from when they fled the scene, she had said, and now that same car was parked a block from his home. Coincidence? Or a message? Damien enlarged the image. But just as he moved to capture the footage, the SUV slipped away. No lights, no sound, leaving no trace. He rose to his feet and stepped out onto the balcony. The city below remained asleep, the dim, amber glow of the street lamps stretching across faded crosswalks at the familiar intersection. Mira wasn't the only one dreaming of shadows returning, and Damien, he knew this wasn't a dream. It was a signal. The first knock at the door of a storm that never truly passed. The morning sky hung heavy, a dull gray curtain seemingly drawn across the entire neighborhood. Damien woke later than usual. The coffee on the kitchen table had gone cold. Mira was nowhere in sight. For a brief second, his heart missed a beat until he heard the sound of water trickling. She was out on the balcony watering the plants. Her face so calm it bordered on unsettling. Damien straightened his collar, regained his usual composure, but inside his thoughts were constricted by the image of last night's car. Something was surfacing from the depths of memory, and he knew it wouldn't stop. When he opened the front door to retrieve the morning paper, he noticed an unfamiliar object wedged beneath the frame. No envelope, no recipient. Just an old yellowed piece of paper folded into quarters, the creases uneven, not like something filed in an office, but something stuffed in haste after a moment of fear. Damien stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the corridor. No one. He unfolded the paper. The message scrawled in soft graphite pencil read, "You really thought we were all dead. No name, no date, no signature." But the handwriting, Damien had seen it before. In a corner of the case file where it described the lure that drew his father to an abandoned house, never to return. In a copied testimony hastily withdrawn by a prisoner just 3 hours after a private session with the internal affairs team. Damien folded the note, placed it on the table, and reached for his phone. He called the local surveillance team. A familiar voice answered. Early this morning, between 4:50 and 5:30 a.m., hallway camera feed was lost due to line failure. No clear reason why. Damien didn't respond. He ended the call and quietly walked toward Mira. She was rinsing her hands in a small basin, her gaze still distant. When she noticed him approaching, she didn't speak, but handed him a small object, a smooth white stone etched with a crescent-shaped symbol in black charcoal. Damien took it, and his breath caught. That symbol. It was once the mark of the gang that had orchestrated his father's death. A faction that vanished without a trace, officially declared neutralized. But silence held its own kind of noise. This wasn't just a warning. It was a message they were back. And this time their target might not be him. It could be her. Mira, a child who had survived one purge, might be the next on their list. Damien tightened his grip around the note. Last night, it was the car. This morning, the message. What would tomorrow bring? That night, after Mira had gone to bed, Damien quietly descended into the basement and unlocked the safe he had once sworn never to touch again, not since his father's death. The contents weren't part of any police archive. They held no legal weight. These were fragments, unofficial, incomplete, and silent, much like the man who left them behind. He opened a small, tin-lined wooden box. Inside lay a weathered brown leather notebook, a rusted sidearm, and an aged map yellowed with time, its lower corner stiff with dried, oxidized blood. The map was hand-drawn in red ink. It wasn't a map of geography, it was a map of faith sketched by a father who trusted only in his own instincts. Its lines followed no national borders, no city grids. Instead, they traced timelines, chain reactions, and names. Damien dropped into the chair beside the work table, the basement light casting a pale glow across his tense features. Every mark was a death. Every red circle represented a disappearance officers who had once served beside his father, who had suddenly resigned, transferred, or in too many cases, taken their own lives. At the center of the map, where all lines converged, was a single name, J. Kessler, the one figure who had never shown his face. Damien copied everything, recreating the web on modern software, and submitted a formal request to the data forensics team for archived files from those disappearance cases. The system responded in its cold, measured tone. Some records are internally encrypted. Level 5 clearance required. Damien was level 4. He closed his eyes. 1 breath, 1 second of stillness. It was time to break the rules. Upstairs, Mira hadn't fallen asleep. She stood quietly at the top of the basement stairs, listening to Damien's low voice, the rustling of papers, the unrolling of the old map. Then, from the inside of her coat pocket, she pulled out a small piece of paper drawn in smudged charcoal. It was a crude map she had been given during her time in the orphanage, labeled only as a restricted zone. She'd always thought it was a joke, a ghost story told by older kids. But now, peering down the stairwell, watching Damien's map unfold under the dim light, she realized they were nearly identical. The next morning, just as Damien stirred from a sleepless night, Mira placed her map on the table. She said nothing, just looked at him. 2 maps, 2 eras, 1 truth buried and waiting to be unearthed. And for the first time, Damien understood Mira was not just a victim to be protected. She carried within her a fragment of memory the entire system had tried to erase. The path leading to tunnel number 4 had long been swallowed by rusted fencing and wild overgrowth. It appeared on no civic map, wasn't listed in the sewer system or power grid. And yet both Damien and Mira knew it was real because 2 maps drawn decades apart both pointed here. A light rain was falling when they arrived. Mira followed Damien in silence, her steps soundless like a shadow. She wasn't afraid anymore, or at least she had grown used to the ache of calling out and never being answered. They stepped inside the tunnel. No lights, no voices. Only the slow drip of unseen water and the faint, ghost-like murmur of something that had never truly slept. Damien switched on his flashlight. The beam swept across the tunnel walls, revealing strange hand-drawn symbols identical to those in his father's notebook. One in particular made him stop cold, 3 interlocking circles, and beneath them scrawled in broken lettering the phrase, "Only those forgotten will remember." Mira stared at the words for a long time. Then, as if tugged from a disordered corner of her memory, she whispered, "This is where they brought the kids, before they were moved." Damien turned to her. "Moved, I mean, disappeared," she said. From deep within the tunnel, a damaged ventilation duct released a high-pitched wheeze, not wind this time, but something steadier, almost mechanical, like the breathing of someone hooked to a machine. Damien motioned for Mira to stay back, then moved closer, his flashlight aimed toward the vent. His heart nearly stopped. Wedged into the rusted grate was a damp, decaying photograph, an old image stained and torn. In it, a young boy sat bound to a metal chair, his face covered with a cloth. Beside him stood a man with a nameplate that read, "R. Evans, Damien's father." Damien dropped to his knees. Everything he had believed about his father's death, killed in an ambush during an investigation, began to unravel. What if his father hadn't died immediately? What if the system had known and chosen silence instead? Mira's voice pulled him back. They tied me like that too, she said quietly. But I didn't cry, because a policeman told me once. If you cry, they win? Damien looked at her no longer with just empathy, but with the profound recognition of two people who had both been left behind, both taught to be strong because breaking was never an option. That night after they returned home, Damien dreamed of his father for the first time in 15 years. But the dream had no face, just the outline of a man resting a hand on his shoulder and saying, "Don't look for me anymore, son. Look for her, because she carries what you and I both forgot." Damien woke up the dream unfinished. But for the first time, something inside him felt lighter. And he knew this was where everything began again, not for vengeance, but for forgiveness. To forgive the right person at the right time. And to do that, he would have to protect Mira from the very thing his father had once tried and failed to stop. That morning, the sky hung in a hushed shade of ash, quiet, as if holding back all the things no one had dared to speak aloud. Damien received one final anonymous message. No words, no coordinates. Just a blurred, aged photograph of a stained concrete wall. Faintly visible on it, nearly lost to time, were the fading words. Those who survive must tell the story. There was no address, no sender. But Damien recognized it instantly. It was the far wall, deep inside tunnel number 4, the part he hadn't dared to reach the first time. Mira insisted on going with him. Damien hesitated, but then nodded because he understood some wounds could only be healed when walked through beside someone who bore the same scars. The entrance to the tunnel was narrower than they remembered. Dust and creeping roots had reached the concrete ceiling, as if nature itself was trying to bury what should never be remembered. But today was no longer an intrusion. Today was a farewell. They passed the corridor marked by old symbols, then arrived at a fractured section of the wall. It was Mira who found the crack, slipping her hand into it and gently pulling it open. Behind was a small room no larger than a forgotten bathroom stall, but on its walls were hundreds of marks, writing carved symbols, even scratches made by fingernails. Everyone who had once been taken here had tried to leave something behind before vanishing. At the center of the wall, written in red, perhaps paint, perhaps blood, perhaps something else, one line remained painfully clear: those who survive must tell the story. Because if we don't, it will all happen again. Damien said nothing. He simply pulled out his phone, took a photo, then opened his notebook. A fresh page. A new heading. The children no one came for. Mira stood beside him, her eyes no longer brimming the way they once had. She placed her hand against the wall for a moment, then stepped back. And for the first time she said, "I won't forget anyone who was here. But I'll live, just like you promised." Damien turned to her and nodded. He no longer saw himself as the adult rescuing a child. They were now two witnesses of two wounded generations who had chosen not to remain silent. Months later, a small book was published, with no author listed. Its title was simple: Room 4, The Dreams No One Touched. The opening line read, "She was the girl no one claimed, but the first person to teach me what it means to leave no one behind." Mira returned to school. Damien withdrew from the special unit and began teaching criminal psychology. He no longer carried a gun each day, but he carried his story and hers to tell those who believed no one wanted to hear. Because he now understood deeply, those who survive must tell the story. And in that truth, they were no longer victims. Thank you for staying with us until the final lines of this story. Not everyone has the courage to walk through a journey marked by so many scars. But if you're still here, it means that somewhere inside you, there is a part that has known loss or is learning how to face it. This story was not written to accuse nor to glorify. It was written to remind that there are fathers who fell so their children could live, that there are children who stayed silent throughout their childhoods, holding on to one last fragile belief in the goodness of people, and that there are survivors who chose not to stay quiet because they understood that only by telling the story can we truly save the next person. If there's anything you carry with you after this series, I hope it's not just the suspense or the tension, but a quiet question you ask yourself. Have I ever forgotten someone just because they stayed silent too long? And perhaps now you see it too, that forgiveness doesn't always need to be spoken aloud, nor does it mean pretending nothing happened. Sometimes it simply means choosing to move forward so the past no longer holds the power to tear apart the days to come. There are those who once protected others in silence, who stepped in front of danger and then disappeared, without names, without medals, because for them, doing the right thing was already enough, and not everyone who grows up in darkness becomes angry. Some, like Mira, choose to keep a small fire burning in their heart, not to warm themselves, but to light the way for others still lost in their own night. Thank you for staying, for not turning away when the story stopped being thrilling and only human quiet remained. If somewhere in these pages, in these moments, or behind those shadows from memory, you saw something of yourself, then keep it. Not as a confession, not as an explanation, but as something gentle and true inside you. And if one day you come across someone like Mira or Damien, someone living between the ache of loss and the hope of healing, please don't let them grow up alone. Until we meet again in another story, where even hearts full of scars can still be tender enough not to kill what's left of faith.